Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles, 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or stream us on Spotify and YouTube. If you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok too. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we are here talking about 1966, once again, second month of the year.
Yes, the year is flying by. I can't believe it. Both 2026 and 1966.
I know. February 2026 was a super quiet year here because of sub-zero constant temperatures. I think it was a little nicer in 1966.
Well, for one of the Beatles and his new bride, definitely.
That is true, because as we left January 1966, Pattie and George had just gotten married.
Yes, they did. And in February, they headed off to their honeymoon in Barbados. One of the very funny stories from their honeymoon was that apparently they were staying at this resort or whatever, which I think is still there. You can go and stay there and pretend you're George and Pattie. I believe that Queen Elizabeth also happened to be there at the same time. So they were just kind of hanging out at the resort, and somebody who worked there was like, "Oh, there's the Queen." And they were like, "No way." And she was like, "No, really, look over there." So they looked over, and there was this big car, big entourage of cars going by. And sure enough, it was Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. A little re-meeting, if you will, of George and the Queen. That's pretty badass for your honeymoon.
I love that. And
yeah.
George wasn't the one who was actively angry about the MBE, so he wouldn't have been angry, I don't think.
That's true. I can't see him being overly excited, but he'd probably been like, that's nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's Parliament that controls the taxes, so if the Prime Minister had come, maybe he would have had a beef, but the Queen, probably okay.
That's true. I mean, I think Pattie was kind of delighted because she wrote about it later.
Her diary is so cute, by the way.
I know. And her book is so good. I need to reread it.
So they're kind of off for a lot of the month, having a nice time. I know George brought his own sitar there to keep practicing, and then he had a better sitar sent to him because he, I guess, was doing a lot more practicing than honeymooning, and he needed a better one. Back in the UK, Paul continues his cultural immersion. He first visits with Stevie Wonder after his UK tour. Stevie was 15 at the time, so he might have been little Stevie Wonder still at that point. And he was touring on his successful single, Uptight, Everything's All Right. Paul was super excited to meet him. Obviously, Motown and American sounds are what drove the Beatles in their early days. Paul is certainly not abandoning that. But he is absolutely supplementing it with some new things. Another event that he took in that month was seeing the avant-garde composer Luciano Berio with his friend Barry Miles, owner of the Indica Gallery. Berio's lecture was about his latest composition, possibly called Labyrinthus 2. If you know the correct pronunciation, let us know. Labyrinthus 2 was a collage of vocals, tape, loops, and instrumentals, which Berio described in the lecture as, quote, "a laboratory reduced to the dimensions of performance, where we test theories and practices which can be used as experimental models of real life."
Sounds like McCartney, too.
One thing about Paul, he takes everything he's ever heard and synthesizes it into his own album.
He really does.
There you go. Paul was also experimenting with this stuff at the time. He had given that Christmas gift to his fellow Beatles, which was that acetate of tape loops that he called Unforgettable. He had actually at one point thought about doing his own solo album, and he jokingly wanted to call it Paul McCartney Goes Too Far.
Oh my gosh, that's so Paul.
I know. He never quite went that far. I kind of wish he did, just because that would be
He might still,
really funny.
There's still time.
That's true. I mean, maybe whatever was on Fireman stuff, maybe that was a taste of
Good point.
What he would have done if he had gone too far. But his life wasn't consumed just with going out on the town. He was also putting the finishing touches on renovations for his brand new home on Cavendish Avenue, which of course he still owns today. His original intent was to turn it into part bachelor pad, part salon for the members of his new intellectual set of friends. He would move in there in a month or so.
Yes. Yes. And it is a pilgrimage spot. If you've never been to London, you got to go past Paul's house. And it's, right around the corner from Abbey Road. So you can kill two birds with one stone. And of course, we just have to mention quickly what Brian was doing, because this is the BC the Beatles podcast, after all. He was producing a play, Alan Platter's A Smashing Day, at the New Arts Theatre. And interesting note about this, it starred a young Ben Kingsley.
I love it that Brian is finally trying to get into the things that really feed his soul, classic theater and arts and everything. Like, he's kind of using his management of the Beatles to do what he wants. And I love that for him.
Exactly. But yeah, you see him doing that more in the last couple of years of his life, which is great for him. And I'm glad that he got a chance to do some of that.
I only wish he had had his own Brian Epstein, his own manager, who could have helped him transition more fully and not quite gone down the road he went when he started losing confidence in his stable of artists, having confidence in him.
I know. God, that's like a whole other podcast, but I think about that a lot. And I think about the fact that, he was so young and he still had so much potential in himself, and his life was so devoted to his boys,
Yeah. If you think about age now, he was thought of as the elder in the Beatles world. He was 31.
He was a baby child. Yeah.
So
it's unreal to think about, but it's great to see him sort of like going back to the theater, which is obviously his first passion.
I would have loved to have seen a Brian Epstein show. I bet it would have been so elegant and fun and probably just a little bit jokingly pretentious. Like, I can just see all the Brian elements coming together.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. That would have been so much fun to see. I would have loved to see him as an actor back at RADA.
I bet he wasn't that bad. I think his own sense of confidence probably tanked him, not his acting abilities.
I think he got into RADA.
Yeah, exactly. He had to audition.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
And weren't his co-classmates like Albert Finney?
I think so. Yeah, Albert Finney, I think, was one of them.
Yeah, very illustrious classmates.
They don't let just anybody. They wouldn't let me into RADA. Let's put it that way. You got to have some talent,
Well, I don't know. Maybe they would let you into RADA. I've never seen you monologue.
Oh, well, maybe let me prepare one.
In not as good news, in 1966, in February, the Cavern Club shuts down for the first time, and the Beatles do not help.
Cool.
I know, it's kind of an icky thing. The Cavern Club in 1966 fell on hard times financially. The owner, Ray McFall, had a bankruptcy, and it shut down for the first time on February 28th. It was quickly actually saved, and it was renovated and reopened in July 1966 with the involvement of Prime Minister Harold Wilson.
That's so random.
Yeah, it is very strange. But in February, they thought this was the end of the end. Ray McFall declared the final night was a free night. It resulted in, of course, chaos and crowds and fights and tears, all of the things that would happen when you open the doors to the cavern to the entire populace of Liverpool. But with the help of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the club was overhauled. It was extended. It was fully reopened on July 23rd, 1966, with new management. So the Beatles were asked about their opinions on this. Paul suggested that maybe the cavern could be saved by turning it into some sort of attraction. But at the time, it wasn't really feasible because this was long before the National Trust ever got involved in these things, or Beatles tourism was an idea that people would have. The Beatles were only 2-3 years old in the popular consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's pretty prescient that Paul already had that thought of like, maybe the cavern's value is tied to us and not the other way around.
Yeah. But he did not go so far as to try to keep it open. And in fact, the Beatles themselves were a bit callous about this whole closing. John said, quote, "We owe nothing to the club. We've done them a favor and made them famous."
Oh, wow.
Thank you, John. So they weren't there at that last night. The final night did not include the Beatles lining up to get in there and have a fight.
Just one more fight for old time's sake. Oh, come on. Something else that happened in February of 1966 that is much more infamous in the Beatles story involves a young lady called Maureen Cleave. And Maureen Cleave is a very fascinating character around this time. She deserves her own biography. Like, I would read that. A little bit about Maureen. Born in 1934, she had been a journalist writing columns on the UK youth scene for 3 years when she first heard of the Beatles. And so her relationship with the Beatles began in early 1963. She was writing a pop music column called Disc Date for the Evening Standard. So a friend from Liverpool told her about the rise of local Beatlemania. Remember, this is early 63. And she asked her boss, who was the Evening Standard editor, Charles Wintour, if she could take a trip to Liverpool to meet and profile them. And before answering, he asked his daughter, Anna, if she had heard of them. And she had. And if you're wondering, yes, that is Anna Wintour of Vogue fame. That was her.
Yeah.
So indirectly, not to foreshadow or spoil anything, but Anna Wintour is responsible for the Bigger Than Jesus controversy.
But fun side note, one thing that Maureen Cleave was known for was being quite fashionable. She was often mentioned in the same breath as people like Mary Quant, people in the zeitgeist who had their real finger on the pop culture of the moment. And one thing she did have was this very distinctive bob hairstyle with bangs. And apparently, young Anna Wintour was enamored with Maureen Cleave. And it is said that her famous iconic bob that she has always had was inspired by Maureen Cleave.
Oh my gosh. Well, now I know what I'm going to ask Anna Wintour if I ever meet her. It's not going to be anything about her career. It's going to be about Maureen Cleave and the bob.
I love it. So Maureen's column was entitled Why the Beatles Create All That Frenzy. It was published in February 1963, just 1 month before Please Please Me broke through into the charts. And it was one of the first pieces outside of Liverpool that attempted to understand the Beatles phenomenon beyond the hair and the suits and the superficial trappings, and probably one of the first articles ever that really treated them as something more than the flavor of the moment, asking their favorite colors, what do you like in a girl, things like that. One defining characteristic of Cleave's writing is that she uses the small details to really telegraph the wider sense of who her subjects are. So her details here, like how John apparently developed catchphrases to say to the audience that he repeated so often that the audience joined in with him. And then when they started doing that, he would find another one. Or how they already in 1963 were saying how they didn't want to pivot into all around entertainers or variety show hosts or anything like that. And she highlighted their collective education, and it helped paint a picture of who they were beyond pop music. But of course, she doesn't skip over the physical, and her description walks the line between honest and maybe too honest. From this article, quote, John Lennon has an upper lip which is brutal in a devastating way. George Harrison is handsome, whimsical, and untidy. Paul McCartney has a round baby face, while Ringo Starr is ugly but cute.
Oh my gosh. Savage Maureen. My goodness.
Well, as we'll see later, she does not stop there. But I think her portraits are really interesting. You really do get a feeling of the whole person from the things that she notes. And I think even the way she writes, and we'll see that as we go through these later portraits of the Beatles and Brian, that she is able to paint a picture with her words and even with the cadence of her words that kind of helps you understand like the emotional world of the person she's talking to.
Yeah, definitely.
She, I think, also approached them with interest, with a respect for their intelligence. She was a little bit older than them, but not old enough that she would be not considered a peer. So she kind of had this nice middle ground between being authoritative enough to write about them and interview them, but also like a buddy. Like they at times used her apartment to hide out from mobs of fans, and they took her with them on their first US tour. She was one of very few people who went with them. Her friendship was especially close with John. They built a deeper relationship when they found they had a shared interest in the Just Williams stories. And there have always been rumors that there was more between the two of them, but it is not known.
Yeah, I go back and forth on that one. I could see it.
I could see it too. And there's plenty of fan fiction that will describe the whole thing in full detail if you're very interested.
Fantastic. I love it. So she had this idea of profiling each of the Beatles and Brian alone and publishing one a week for 5 weeks. Both of her editors and the Beatles were happy to do it. And so the result was a series of double-page features on each, in depth and showing the band in a way that few pop culture figures were profiled at the time. It was also unusual because it was a lot of newspaper space to be taken up during a time when the band wasn't on a press junket or promoting anything specific like an album or a movie. They were just, as we've talked about, this is kind of a down period for them. They're kind of just hanging out in London or in Barbados or, wherever. So there was nothing really to tie these two. They were just there for human interest. And maybe, Maureen, being close to the Beatles, knew that they were on a cusp of something incredibly personal and artistic, a real transition in their career. Or maybe she just had timing on her side. But, either way, these 5 profiles give a really, really astounding and interesting insight into who they were becoming in this period. When you read these pieces, it's really far from their friendly Fab Four personas, quote unquote. So these were published throughout March, but the majority of interviews were conducted in the quiet weeks of February 1966. Another thing that's really fascinating about these articles is they're not just really interviews in the traditional sense, but they're kind of anthropological studies. She aimed to meet all of them in their own home environments, and she did, except for Paul, who she met at a restaurant, which interesting, maybe because of his home renovations, who knows?
I think so.
And the running theme for all of these, which is pretty evident when you read them, is quote unquote, how a Beatle lives.
It's interesting to me that when she does How a Beatle Lives and her profile is 4 Beatles plus Brian, not plus George Martin too, not plus Tony Barrow, 5 Beatles and Brian, How a Beatle Lives.
Well, if you need more evidence that he is the 5th Beatle.
Yeah, I mean, my theory on the 5th Beatle is that 1966 is the point at which that changes. That we kind of revolve from Brian into George Martin as we get into the recording of Revolver and this kind of rift between who the Beatles were and who the Beatles are becoming. Put Brian out in the cold a little bit because he has less to do and George Martin has more to do.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe that is something to consider with the whole 5th Beatle debate, as it does sort of evolve over time. Well, let's start with John.
We're talking about them in the order they appeared in the paper, not necessarily the order that they were conducted in, but we'll take her word on it that this is the right order.
So Maureen visited John in Weybridge at his home. She notes that the Beatles have never had time off like they have in the last month or so. And when she rings John's gate to be let in, he asks what day it is. So we've all been there when we've had time off.
It's like COVID.
It is like COVID. It was John's COVID. According to her, during this period, the Beatles were really only hanging out with each other. They were going to each other's homes or, John and Sin were going to Ringo and Maureen's or like vice versa, or Paul was coming over. Like it was really kind of insular. And she starts right in, honestly. She goes right in for John's physical appearance. And she says, quote, he looks more like Henry VIII than ever now that his face is filled out.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, keep in mind, this is also when John's not feeling himself. He's kind of feeling bad about how he looks. So I'm sure this was kind of hard to read. Mm-hmm. But she says he is just as imperious, just as unpredictable, indolent, disorganized, childish, vague, charming, and quick-witted. So she redeems herself at the end. She observed that he has lived in a curiously timeless existence since the Beatles took a rest, in a house cluttered with scores of objects he has since lost interest in. And she goes into very great detail about all these objects. She describes the house as a large, heavily paneled, heavily carpeted mock Tudor house set on a hill. And some of the highlights of the things in this house, John points to a suit of armor and says, that's Sydney. He points to a room full of model racing cars and says, that's a hobby I had for a week. He also points to a fruit machine, which I'm not super sure what that is, but he says that Sin won't let him get rid of it. Do you know what a fruit machine is?
Maybe like a juicer?
That's what I was thinking.
That's the closest thing I can think. Like, what else in 1966 would be a fruit machine? Like, they don't I don't think he would have gotten like a snow cone machine at that time.
Yeah, I guess it would have to be a juicer. Anyway. But in the sitting room, interestingly, there are 8 little green boxes with winking red lights. And so he bought them as Christmas presents in, I'm guessing, 1965. And he never got around to giving them away. So they just sort of sit there. Maureen Cleave says they wink for a year. One imagines him sitting there until next Christmas, surrounded by little winking boxes.
Oh my God, I would freak out.
That would be really irritating, especially in the sitting room. Like, come on. You live in like a huge mansion. Just put them in a room for themselves.
Right?
But he actually does have some stuff he still likes. She says he paused over objects he still fancies. A huge altar crucifix of a Roman Catholic nature with IHS on it, which is like a banner that's usually hung over Jesus or whoever on the crucifix, whoever, meaning Jesus because he's the one being crucified. A pair of crutches, which were a present from George, an enormous Bible he bought in Chester, and his gorilla suit. Now, the gorilla suit, he goes on at length about the gorilla suit, but what I'm finding very interesting here is that he is really interested in religion, which we'll see obviously come into play further down in the article. But the fact that he's still interested in his religious artifacts is pretty foretelling of what's to come. Something else that recently happened in John's life at this point was that his father, Fred, had paid him a visit. And if you are unfamiliar with the story of John's father, basically he abandoned John as a child. He gave John a choice whether to come with him or stay with his mother, Julia. John chose Julia, and Fred sort of like fucked off to New Zealand. So only after John was famous did Fred start to come back around. And so Fred was at the house and John threw him out. Basically, he was like, I want nothing to do with this guy.
And I looked into why. It was really interesting what was going on at this time. It was true. John does exaggerate throughout this profile. Like he says, I've read 1 million books. I don't think he had time in his life yet to read 1 million books. But in this case, he actually did throw him out. Ever since the abandonment moment, John had had an infrequent but pretty volatile relationship with his dad. They reconnected a bit in 1964. And to be fair to both sides of the story, Freddie at this point had come back to the UK, but he was trying his best to stay incognito, not be connected with John, not get found out that he was there, but the press found him out. Before they published their expose, he had one request. Freddie asked if he could find John on his own and connect with him so that he wasn't surprised by this expose being published in a paper. So they held off. Freddie got connected with Brian, and they had their first meeting in many years in Brian's office in 1964. John actually was really excited about it at first. He even called his friend Pete Shotton back from Liverpool the next day and was like, yeah, my dad's kind of funny like me. Like he was excited, but that's some deep trauma. And their relationship, when they did see each other, ran very hot and cold. It was mostly cold. He had visited for a couple of days in 64, but it didn't go so well. And they kind of lost touch for the next year or so. But at the end of 1965, the talent manager, Tony Cartwright, who also happens to be Tom Jones's father, had found Freddie working as a dishwasher in Surrey. And Freddie, of course, did have some musical talent. He and Julia had bonded over singing in the pubs as a young couple. Cartwright swiftly capitalized on this. He wrote a very campy song called That's My Life, a bombastic retelling of Freddie's life, complete with a 30-piece orchestra and ocean wave sound effects. It's perfectly ridiculous and horrible.
Wow. I mean, like the ocean waves because he was a seaman, if you will.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Wow.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Yeah. It's some bad stuff. Maybe a natural precursor to Yellow Submarine. Who knows? Maybe
There
so.
you go.
But John was naturally not inspired by this. He was furious at his father so publicly cashing in on his son's fame, and really without telling him at this time. Cynthia Lennon wrote in her book, John, quote, at Christmas 1965, we heard that Alf had made a record under the trendier name of Fred Lennon. That's My Life, My Love, and My Home, the song, was awful and hugely embarrassing to John, who was furious at his father's blatant jump into the bandwagon of his own success. He asked Brian to do anything he could to stop it. Whether Brian did or not, I don't know, but the record never made it into the charts and soon disappeared. Freddie had shortly after come to see John in Weybridge to ask him why his song was no longer charting. And this is the moment where John had slammed the door in his face.
Wow. That's why he comes to Weybridge, to ask John that question?
Basically,
That's crazy. Wow.
Yeah. In March of 1966, he actually does tour Australia with the song. So it's not like he's not doing anything with it.
Wow. That's some dark shit.
Yeah, it really is.
Oh my gosh. Well, pivoting on the music note, I guess, I found this pretty interesting. John played Maureen some Indian music that George introduced him to, saying, quote, "It's amazing. This is so cool." It's very fascinating to me because you don't generally think of John as like someone who loved Indian music like George did. But I guess the novelty of it in the beginning, obviously they've been introduced to it on the Help set, but maybe this is seeping into their music finally when they're in this gestation period. Maybe, this focus on Indian music really turned his mind to religion along with all of his little artifacts, because soon after he delivers the infamous quote, and say it with me. No, I'm kidding. So, quote, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." And just to say, in this period, after this article comes out, it really doesn't do much. The quote doesn't set off anything until it gets popularized in the US later in 66. So it's presented without much fanfare in the article. I just found that really interesting.
No fanfare at all. There's a call out. Every single one has a call out. And his call out is something about being rich. It has nothing to do with this.
Yeah. Yeah. So it wasn't incendiary. It was published in Maureen's column. John had obviously clearly been thinking about all of these themes. He was a reader. He was a reader his whole life. He read voraciously. And one book he recently read was 1965's The Passover Plot by Hugh Schonfield. This was a bestseller. It argued that Jesus deliberately planned to fulfill Jewish messianic prophecies by staging events of his life, including his arrest and crucifixion, but that his plan went tragically wrong when he unexpectedly died on the cross rather than surviving as intended. So, according to Schoenfield, the resurrection narratives were later shaped by followers who believed in him rather than being the result of a literal supernatural event. John's life right now is like very, very religious in some ways.
Yeah. And about, followers who turned something into some kind of mythic supernatural event on their own accord. That's something that John is currently experiencing anytime he goes out into a concert. So I'm sure he resonated. Yeah.
That's very true. Very true. Parallels. But overall, the profile of John highlights a life full of endless contradictions, consuming objects, hobbies, books with intense intellectual fervor, and then laying them aside, like losing interest in them. Cleve later pronounced him, quote, "probably the laziest person in England." John is clearly, in 1966, we find him a man in search of something. He doesn't know what it is, but he's definitely seeking out something. And she quotes him to say, quote, "You see, there's something else I'm going to do, something I must do, only I don't know what it is. That's why I go around painting and taping and drawing and writing and that, because it may be one of them. All I know is this isn't for me." It's just fascinating how honest they were with her.
Yeah, they really took her through their good points and their bad points. They didn't sugarcoat anything, especially John.
Yeah, they really trusted her.
Yeah, and John, he was particularly close with her. And he was taking a lot of LSD at the time, which was resulting in sort of an ego death for him, as he said. So his ego must have been like an open wound in a way, like just very tender.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, she did not experience the same sort of open wound when she went to visit Ringo.
Shocking.
No. For the second profile, Maureen Cleve visited Ringo at his suburban mansion in Weybridge, just down the street from John. And despite a very similar lifestyle with his family in the suburbs, the picture she paints of Ringo's life is practically the opposite of John's. With his large property and a wife, a new baby son, and his 2 dogs, her article paints a picture of a happy family man, though she observes that Ringo himself, with his tight jeans, high black suede boots, suede waistcoat, long hair, and of course gold rings, is the most unusual thing in the setting. She says, quote, "This makes him a charming host and restful company. His only ambition to end up sort of unforgettable was rather vague, and he has achieved in a roundabout way. Things turn out right for Ringo."
She's not wrong. He is unforgettable.
Cleve then turns to the interior of the house, similar to John's. She's remarking on all of the things that she's seeing, trying to paint a picture of the person who lives there. She notes the home space and its comfort, and that it is, quote, "much admired by the other Beatles." His shelves contain a variety of objects, trophies, gold records, a piece of fossilized wood from the Libyan desert, a miniature cannon, and, quote, "a perfectly horrible small brown stuffed puppy dog standing on a piece of carpet in a glass case, a present from John. I think it's nice," Ringo said, end quote.
Wow, morbid.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's like a stuffed animal. Oh my God.
I'm guessing it's taxidermied, but that's just me.
Oh, let's have diverging fantasies of this.
Let's definitely let's never know.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll ask Ringo his next birthday.
Could you imagine?
When I see him at his Beverly Hills birthday party.
You got to ask him something about dogs.
Exactly. I got to keep up the tradition of asking him about his pets. And I'll be like, did you ever own a taxidermied puppy?
Oh my God.
Was it a present from John?
And did you like it? You think it's nice?
Did you? Yeah. Did you think it's nice?
Ew.
That's what you said.
Moving on, he also has lots of space reserved for his guns and other cowboy ephemera, including the holster Elvis gave him and a knife that last belonged to the last queen of Madagascar. But his favorite part of the house might be the bar, which he calls the Flying Cow. He says, quote, "I've always wanted a pub for movies, I think. What I would like would be for about 15 of my friends to pop in here without being asked, without me being here even," end quote. So Cleve noticed the homey atmosphere. George's wife Pattie phoned in, then John stopped by with Julian. Ringo had recalled that he had once had a plan for if he became prime minister, where, quote, "he wanted everybody's house joined to the houses of friends by underground tubes." So cute.
Well, that is really sweet. It's very Ringo. It's very Ringo of the time, too, because he was very, nested, with his new family.
Yeah, he just wants to be like the master of the house in some kind of tavern. And though he says he was once afraid of both dogs and babies, he loves having both. He also loves being married. Though he casually mentions, quote, "I own her, of course," he said comfortably. "When I married her, her parents signed her over to me. That just knocked me out. She's still a minor, you see," end quote.
Oh my God, that's so fucked up.
People did things differently 60 years ago.
Yes, definitely. I mean, Maureen was very young when she married Ringo.
Cleve includes a variety of snippets of Ringo's various opinions on things throughout. Here's a few of them. He's got plenty of antennas, so he can get all 4 stations because he gets all of his information from TV. His is a house of night owls who typically rise between noon and 4 p.m. each day. He muses on his childhood spent ill and out of school for much of it, observing, quote, "I'm not thick. It's just that I'm uneducated," unquote. He reflects on his position as the last to join the Beatles, telling Cleve that he only started feeling like a real member of the band about 18 months prior, which would have been mid-1964 after the U.S. visit. He's got a lot of pride in the UK and its accomplishments, and he thinks the upper classes are much improved. Quote, he says, "Much less piggy and interbred. I've seen their old portraits and they look just like pigs," end quote. He'd like to meet Paul Newman. He has no wish to be taller, and if a bomb were to be dropped, he'd like to know where it will be so he can stand right under it.
Oh my God.
I guess it makes sense. If you're going to get the A-bomb, it's going to be miserable. Might as well end it while you can before you have to feel it.
The logic is sound.
It is. Cleve's final assessment on Ringo, quote, "Though the smallest, the cutest, and the favorite of tiny children, he seems less complicated and more mature than the others. Indeed, he gives the impression of being utterly contented."
She really does do a great job of really encapsulating them, because that all makes total sense for Ringo, especially at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just the way she describes his house and his decor, like it's dark, it's comfortable, everybody likes it. It just feels right.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, He mentions that bar a lot. Like that was his pride and joy at that house. So it's
Yeah.
nice that it gets a little mention here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So George is the third Beatle observed at his own home. He's also married, obviously, and he's living in the suburbs. So his article is titled George Harrison, Avocado with Everything. And it's probably the most comprehensive profile of George that had been written to date. And it showcases the inherent contradictions present in George throughout his life. So he's portrayed as a, quote, strong-willed and uncompromising character with a strict regard for what he considers to be the truth. He's a man of contradictions who admits his difficulty writing lyrics and, quote, bitterly regrets having abandoned his early habit of eating and sleeping on the stage. All right. Brian would have loved that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, his disdain for fame is blunt, which is very Georgian. He says, I never asked to be famous. I can tell you that I got more famous than I wanted to be. But his enthusiasm for the material benefits of wealth are fully present, which Cleve exemplifies in this bit about avocados. He says, instead of eggs and beans and steak, you branch out into the avocado scene. I never dreamt I would like avocado pears. I thought it was like eating bits of wax, fake pears out of a bowl, when I saw people shoving it down. And now he shoves it down like the rest. As somebody who hates avocados, that's disgusting.
I happen to like avocados, but I like the metaphor as well. It really gives this sense of somebody who he didn't live in a wealthy community and now he does. And now his tastes are changing because he's experiencing more and, maybe even just peer pressure.
Yeah, for sure. I can't imagine, many Liverpudlian tables in the late 40s, early 50s that had avocados on them.
No, probably not.
So, it is a status symbol. And he's newly married. He also has a view of his marriage that lurches from genuine affection, saying, quote, that's the great thing about a wife, you see, she's your best friend. Oh. To blunt pragmatism, quote, I married her, he said, because I loved her and because I was fed up not being married. 22 is the normal age for people to get married. That's when a petrol pump attendant gets married, though he hasn't got all these people looking at him.
So romantic.
Yeah, very romantic. Yeah. And of course, he has to touch on Indian music. His enthusiasm about Indian music is really infectious, she says. And the strong yet simplistic views about government and taxation that would soon be aired in Taxman are on full display. And interestingly, like John, George also airs some really strong views about religion. And he says, I think religion falls flat on its face. All this love thy neighbor, but none of them are doing it. How can anybody get themselves into the position of being Pope and accept all the glory and the money and the Mercedes-Benz and that? If Christianity is as good as they say it is, it should stand up to a bit of discussion. And that's interesting. I mean, it's strange to me that John's is obviously very blatant in his terminology about Christianity and religion, but George also mentions it. And before this episode, I've never read that quote before or heard about that.
I think as we'll get into 1966, obviously, we'll touch a lot on this, but I think part of the problem was that John compared the Beatles to Christianity. And I think there were a lot of people, especially in the media, who were kind of waiting for this bubble to burst, thought the Beatles had become way too big for their britches. And then here's John talking about Christianity. So when it took hold in the Deep South, there was actually some real, religiously backed rage beneath the boycotts, but probably the people who first published it were intrigued by it because they thought John was just being condescending and too big for his britches. So it's a weird thing.
Yeah, it is. It is. George is a little bit conscious of this article and how he might be perceived by Cleve's readers. And he tells her, quote, I don't want my article to end up sad. Me in nowhere land, making all of my nothing plans for nobody. I don't want the angry young man against the world of sort of ending. I tell you what I think. The main thing is to have a good time and do the best you can. Wise words.
There's something funny about that whole thing that stands out as, I know that I'm going to look like an asshole right now, a curmudgeon, and I got to say something where I don't totally look like that.
I know, he's like, everything sucks, but no, it's cool.
Yeah, just be happy. Be happy.
Just be happy. Just have a good time.
Now we move. After 3 profiles focusing on suburban home life, focus turns to London. Paul is not interviewed in any home environment, but he meets Cleve at a restaurant. And in a way, that does kind of sum up Paul right now. His life is essentially in flux, in transit. He had recently bought his Cavendish Avenue house, but he was still living with his girlfriend Jane Asher's family in an attic room in their house. And so he didn't quite have a fixed residence. He didn't have a home, and maybe he didn't want that to be known in a newspaper that he lived there either. So it could have been a privacy thing. It could have just been because by the time it was published, he might be moving into Cavendish Avenue. So he's just still kind of up in the air. Paul's profile is very, very Paul. Paul is, quote, interesting and complicated, end quote, and a man of, quote, wicked charm, a shriveling wit, critical intelligence, and enormous talent. He has the energy of a man on a mission, determined to learn as much as he can, do as much as he can, be as much as he can. He's enamored with the arts and his newly purchased home. He admits that he was tempted to join the other three Beatles in Weybridge. He told Cleve, quote, I thought maybe we should all be grown up together, end quote. But in the end, he thought better of it. But Paul is shown as a man interested in everything life as a Beatle has to offer and excessively sharp-witted. Paul's profile is perhaps less revealing than the others because he had already expressed many of these thoughts elsewhere, like in the late 1965 profile in London Life magazine that we talked about a few episodes ago. Cleve's descriptions offer an added sense of what it's like to engage with him. And like we talked about before, this is something she does in all these profiles with her writing style. So being with John kind of feels a bit hazy and out of time. An evening with Ringo is comfortable and warm. A conversation with George features shifts in both topic and mood, a bit spikier, though, than the one with John. And spending time with Paul, you're full of energy and quick wits, his mind popping from one interest to the next, bringing snippets of his knowledge into the conversation, though maybe not using those snippets exactly in the right context. Cleve notes, quote, his conversation is as peppered as a restoration comedy with asides of this sort. They can be disconcerting. Oh, septudial is one he likes. But he relates it to nothing in particular.
Yeah, that's very Paul to toss in little snippets of just random shit every once in a while.
And some of his more experimental songs kind of sound like that too.
True.
So very much like, this is Paul's character. Despite an overall charming and pleasant profile, she pops in a couple of things that are objectively way more incendiary potentially than anything either George or John said in theirs. He's particularly hard on Americans. He condemns their puritanical nature and he slams them for racism. In reference to Americans, he says, and this is how it's printed, quote, it makes me sad for them. And it's a lousy country where anyone who is Black is made to seem a dirty N-word. In contrast, in England, he says, quote, we look at things a lot better over here. We have millions of little societies preserving things.
Wow. Well, this definitely tracks insofar as, how the Beatles feel about America when they tour in the Deep South.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't too far from the time when they refused to perform in front of any segregated audiences. So
right.
He was certainly angry about that. But the funny thing about it is that when these articles were printed in the US in the magazine Datebook, that particular quote was on the cover. And yet they still went with John.
Oh, yeah, I do remember that because I think I had that issue of Datebook and that quote is on the cover. Nothing gets people more riled up than an attack on Christianity, I guess, not even racism. Consider that in the Deep South, it was a very racist place, and so they couldn't really fight against that. But you're going to attack Jesus? Hell no.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Maybe coming from a 2026 perspective, when I see that word in print in any way, I'm like, oh my God, what the hell?
Yeah, that word. I mean, that's obviously a loaded word back then. And I think Paul, chose his words carefully because that was what he was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to bring this home now with my boy, with Brian. And his profile is the last to be published. Cleve's relationship with him is a little bit different. She has obviously a canny insight into the four Beatles, who she's known well for years. But her profile with Brian reads as if she's sort of trying to understand her own thoughts on him in real time. And so Brian, as we know, is the ultimate enigma. He's fastidious, he's dignified, and, quote, exceedingly well off, but this is the only thing about him of which one might be reasonably certain. His demeanor oscillates between calm and agitated. He wears vulnerabilities on his sleeve, as sensitive as a bare wire, she says. He's an unconventional businessman and a lover of theater, but not of management, interestingly enough. And so, like John, George, and Ringo's profiles, Brian is described primarily by his surroundings. His impeccably designed home with large oil paintings, his eclectic record and book collection, his elaborate food and drink, and a house fitted throughout with intercoms so the visitors can be announced to any room in the house. And so this is his house in Belgravia, where she visited him, the house where he would ultimately pass away. And she notes his many contradictions in taste and temperament, but also suggests that Brian himself is a little self-aware and on the joke. Even though he paints himself as a very posh Londoner, as he wished he would be, he's still Liverpudlian at heart. She notes that what she calls his, quote, little vanities, like his telegraphic address, the registered shorthand code used to receive faxes was Nemperor, are amusing, and he finds them quite funny himself. I love that. Loves a play on words. Cleve reveals some of the vulnerabilities that lie beneath his mercurial persona. She notes his ability to not be there when there is any awkwardness, hiding out with a cup of tea in his hotel room while a press conference gets rough in the lobby below, for example. That's more of a Neil thing, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's what these people to deal with that.
That's why Neil's there. Yes, Neil can handle it. With the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that Brian's contradictions and errors are intentional. He lived in a very different time. He had a persona developed to maintain an arm's length distance from everyone as a gay man in an era where homosexual acts were still illegal. In one brief moment in this interview, he reveals a sense of someone who's on the outside looking in. He says of the three Beatles' marriages, quote, I envy so much their married lives. I could not adapt myself to it particularly, but I do envy it in a way. Just being with Ringo at home makes me feel secure. Oh, that's so sweet and so sad.
It is.
But regardless of any contradictions in his personality, Brian is unfailingly consistent in his complete devotion to the Beatles. Cleve notes that if there's one thing that makes Brian Epstein an exceptional human being, it is his ability to get on with them. To manage, steer, cajole, persuade, and dissuade four of the most cantankerous and self-willed young men during the 4.5 years it took them to become world famous is a truly remarkable achievement.
Now, I love this. I just have to say I love this because she spends 5 weeks profiling these four guys so she can make her case that this is who they are. Then she profiles Brian and she says, this is the magic right here.
Yeah, hell yeah.
It's such a cool way of writing.
It's so true. And, it does take a foundation like Brian to reel in these four different personalities that we've seen. Her articles point out just how disparate they are and how their interests were evolving. And, it sort of shows the very seeds of how they were going to grow as individuals over the next few years. And so Brian is really the rock here. So it's appropriate that she sort of ends on Brian.
Cleve's article on Brian opens by acknowledging the questions about who Brian is as a person. There was a lot of rumors. Is he angry? Is he happy? Is he a good manager? Is he a bad? There's all these different things because no one quite knows him. Though Brian doesn't allow her complete access to his inner world, she ends her profile by laying out the sense of mutual admiration and loyalty that cements this relationship. She says, quote, the Beatles admire him because he has always been on their side, carrying their sorrows, fighting the record companies, literally speechless with delight when they topped the American hit parade, hysterical with laughter at their films. When he asked if they would mind if he sold out to a bigger company, they said they would never sing another note.
This was such a golden period for them all.
Yeah, it really was. And together, these 5 profiles reveal the true nature of who the Beatles actually were as people as they begin 1966, unraveling any remaining myth of a unified entity, or as Mick Jagger coined, the 4-headed monster. They were anything but carbon copies of one another. And Cleve highlights the shifts that have been growing under the radar for some time. 4 vastly different Beatles and one manager who would do anything to represent their interests, even if their interests might someday be opposed to his and detrimental to the Beatles' future.
Brian was always looking out for them. I think had he lived, who knows what would have happened, but I think he always had their best interests at heart.
I think he did. And I think maybe the choices that he made in defense of the Beatles may not have been, had he thought about them a little bit more, maybe he would have made a different decision. A moment of pain would have made a better long-term goal. I say that in some of his decisions around maybe the Philippines trip, which we'll get to. And of course, the butcher covered drink if you're playing the drinking game.
Oh my gosh, you have gone so far in this episode without mentioning the butcher cover.
I know.
I'm so proud of you.
But we're almost in March. We're almost in March 66, guys. It's coming.
I'm so excited.
Yeah. But at this point in February, the conflicts that are bubbling up are still pretty small. The Beatles are experimenting musically, are no longer wearing identical suits. John said, I think in 64, my little act of rebellion was loosening my tie on stage. They're showing that maybe they were a little uncomfortable in these personas, but for the big things, the touring, the press appearances, the clean public image, the Beatles are still willing to follow Brian's lead. But the changes to come in the next few months will test and ultimately change the fabric of this relationship and the balance of power between Brian and the band. And we'll start getting there. Our next installment of the 1966 series, when we'll look at the month of March and the UK reception to Cleve's profiles in the Evening Standard. And then we'll dive into that March 25th press session and photo shoot, where the divide between the old and the new Beatles was never more clear. As Beatles press officer Tony Barrow once said, quote, "The year's downhill trend began on Friday, March 25th.
Ooh, I can't wait.
Very exciting and lots of fun. So that's it for us today. Thanks so much for listening to BC the Beatles. As always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now, and give us a rating and review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos and more from this episode and beyond. And you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. And we will see you next time. Bye.